Hello, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to the Book of Deuteronomy, Telling and Retelling with Rabbi David Silber, showing Rabbi Silber as he delves into Deuteronomy, a new version of an old story. Sources for today's class are coming from the Tanakh. If you have your own Tanakh or Chumash, you're certainly welcome to follow along with that. Sources will be shared on screen from Sefaria as well. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Rabbi Silber.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you may be. Okay, we are continuing with the Moshe's retelling of the journey to enter the land. Of course, in the Torah, Israel never actually enters the land, but there is this journey. The second generation, the first generation has died. The second generation now is moving forward. And that's how the book of Devarim begins. And Moshe, in retelling the story, picks out some of the things that happened in the past. It's very selective. And we're in the midst of his describing the journey that Israel took after the first generation has died, the journey they took. They're passing near the land of Edom, the land of Ammon, the land of Moab. Moshe describes that. His description seems to be at variance at some points with the earliest story that we find in the book of Bamidbar. But we're in the midst of that story, and we're about to encounter in our study, in the second chapter, Israel's meeting and fighting and defeating the king of Sichon. Now, that story of Sichon is found first in the book of Bamidbar. And I wanted to look at that story in Bamidbar and then look at our chapter and see how our chapter differs. That's going to be one focus. And the second related focus I'd like to talk about this morning is after the land of Sichon and Og have been captured, that two of the tribes come to Moshe and request that they possess that land. The tribe of Gad and the tribe of Reuven and Gad. And in the Torah, in Bamidbar, there's a very long interaction, a negotiation, one could say, between Moshe and Israel on one side and the tribe of Gad and Reuven on the other. And that story is retold as well in the book of Devarim, chapter 3. So those are the two related topics that I'd like to look at this morning. So let's take a look first back in the book of Bamidbar, chapter 21. Chapter 21. We have verse number 21. Chapter 21, verse 21, the book of Bamidbar. Now, in the book of Bamidbar, we remember, it talks about Moshe sending a message to the king of Edom. It does not mention Ammon and Moab. That's mentioned in our book, in Devarim. But we discussed this last week. Moshe is sending messages to Edom, and Edom's response back in chapter 20 of Bamidbar, and how it differs from the story that's being told in the book of Devarim. That was last week. But now they've circumvented Edom, and now we have in chapter 21, verse 21, we have the following. It says, Vayishlach Yisrael malachim el Sichon amelech emori lemor. Ebra bi'artzecha. Lo niteh b'sodeh u'v'cherem lo nishtem be'er. B'derech hamelech nelech ad asher na'avar gvulecha. So it says that Israel sent messengers to Sichon and requesting of Sichon that they be permitted to pass through. I will pass through your land. I'm not going to go this way or that way. I'm going to pass straight through B'derech HaMelech, walk on the main highway right through the land. And we're not going to eat or drink anything. Just walk straight through. And the Torah says, in response to that request, I'm not sure it's actually a request. It might sound more like an ultimatum. Notice that they don't say please, nabra na, which we have elsewhere. And they say we're not going to eat or drink anything, just walk straight through, which seems very improbable. In any event, the response is V'lo natan sichon et Yisrael avar b'gvulo, vayesov sichon et kol amo vayetzei likrat Yisrael hamidbara, vayavo yatsa vayilachem b'Yisrael, vayakel Yisrael leficharev, vayirashet atzo me'arnon ad yaboka b'nei Amon ki az gvul b'nei Amon. So, in the next verse, vayikach Yisrael et kol harim ha'eleh, vayeshev Yisrael b'chol harei Amori b'cheshbon u'v'chol b'noteha. So the Torah says in the book of Bamidbar that when Israel sent this message to Sichon, Sichon gathered his army. There's a war. In the war, Israel is victorious, and not just victorious, but they also possess the land of Sichon. In the verse number 25 is explicit. Vayeshev Yisrael b'chol harei Amori b'cheshbon v'chol b'noteha. Israel dwelt in those cities, including the city of Cheshbon, which is the main city. As the text continues to say, Ki Cheshbon ir Sichon melch Amorihi v'hu nilcham b'melech Moav harishon vayikach et kol artzo miyado ad Arnon. So the Torah gives us a history and actually even a little song about the great war between Sichon, the Amorite king, and Moab. There was a war way back between Sichon and Moab, in which Sichon captured a big portion of Moab's land. And that land, having been captured by Sichon, the Amori, is considered to be Amori land. Amori, one of the nations of Canaan. So it's their land. So in effect, when Israel defeats Sichon, they are capturing Canaanite land, as it were, on the other side of the Jordan. They haven't crossed the Jordan. But that land formerly belonged to Moab. From Moab's perspective, we discover much later in the Tanakh, it's still their land. They don't necessarily accept the fact that since it was captured by Sichon, it's not no Moabite land. That's a whole separate question. But in effect, this is the first successful battle of Israel against Amori, against Canaanites. It's a battle that it takes place in chapter 21, which is after the death of the first generation. First generation dies in chapter 20. So this, in a certain sense, one can consider this to be the beginning of the conquest of the land of Israel. Although, once again, it's on this side of the Jordan. That is to say, they don't cross the Jordan. So the status of the land is actually, I would say, a big question. How does one see this land that they captured? From one perspective, it's not the promised land. The boundaries do not seem to include the other side of the Jordan. On the other hand, this land is captured. They defeat the Canaanites and they possess their land. So this is a big question. And here I believe there's a difference between the book of Bamidbar and the book of Devarim, although it is complicated. Complicated, I mean, it's not so simple, even the book of Bamidbar. But here's what's interesting. In the book of Bamidbar, what we just read, it sounds like Israel's trying to cross over to the other side. They're trying every which way to cross over. And when it comes to Sichon, instead of saying no or negotiating, he brings his army out. He starts a war. I mean, he may have been provoked by Israel's request, but he starts a war in which he is defeated, and not just defeated in the war, but Israel actually takes the land. That's a very important point. The first capture of land. Now let's see this very same story in the book of Devarim. Very same story in the book of Devarim. Let's turn our attention to chapter 2, I believe it is. Chapter 2. Let's see. Chapter 2, verse number 24. So God has told Israel they are not to take any land of Esav or land of Ammon, or land of Moab, because I gave them their land. That we studied. And remember that the proof that God gave them their land in the book of Devarim is that those people, Esav and Ammon and Moab, defeated the giants, the Rephaim, the Amim, the Zamzumim, etc. And you can't defeat those giants, the Torah seems to say, without divine assistance. Therefore, since they did defeat them, since they did defeat them, it means that God assists them, means that God is giving them that land. And you can't take their land from them. You have your own land. And in fact, the fact that Israel defeats Og, who's a giant, that's in chapter 3, is also proof that God is assisting them. That's what it says in Sefer Devarim. So after God has told us we can't possess the land of Edom and Ammon and Moab, we come to chapter 2, verse number 24. Here we have the following. Kumu Sa'u v'yivru et Nachal Arnon. Ri'en atati biyadchat sichon no cheshbon ha'mori v'et artso ha'chel rosh v'itgar bo milchama. So we have God saying to Israel, you couldn't take this, you couldn't take that, but cross over the Wadi Arnon, and I give you, look, I've given you the land of Sichon, the king of Heshbon, the Amorite. Hachel Rosh, go and possess it. Start up a war. In other words, that's what's missing in the book of Bamidbar. Here we have, before the war with Sichon, we have a divine statement that this land is land you can possess. You can possess this land. And in fact, the very next verse is actually quite interesting. Hayom hazeh, achel teipachtecha v'yiratcha al pnei ha'amim tachat kol hashamayim, asher yishma'un shimacha, v'ragzu v'chalu mipanecha. On this very day, I will place the dread, pachad, yira, the dread, the fear, over all the nations under the heavens, who will hear shimacha, who will hear what you've done. V'ragzu v'chalu mipanecha. They will quake and shake, tremble and quake before you. Whenever they hear you, whenever they hear about you, they will be frightened. That's a very interesting verse. It reminds us actually of another verse, that the nations who hear of your exploits will be frightened. Exactly. In Shirat Hayam, we have actually virtually the same words. Shamu amim yirgazun, chil lachaz yoshvei pelashet, aznu v'lu alfei adam. Those who hear about you, and there's actually 7 different words in this Song of the Sea, Shirat Hayam, which talk about the fear. Roges is right. You have Emor v'Fachad, you have Yira, you have these words appear in Shirat Hayam, and they're about the crossing of the sea. What's particularly interesting about this, by the way, is the following. That you remember the story in the book of Yoshua, towards the beginning of the Yoshua, it's one of the Haftarot as well, where Yoshua sends spies into the land. He sends in spies, and the spies end up in the house of a woman named Rachav. She's a prostitute, and she has a house right on the boundary, right on the wall of Jericho. She lives there, and the spies go to her house. They want to get information about how the people feel, what's going on, and Rachav says to them that everybody is very afraid of you. That's what Rachav says. Everybody's frightened. Why are they so frightened? She mentions 2 particular things that caused everybody in Yericho to be afraid. The first is they all remember the splitting of the sea. That's the first thing. And they all remember the war against Sichon. So Rachav actually, in her speech to the spies, ties those 2 things together. There's the leaving of Egypt, which is the story of the first generation leaving Egypt, and the war against Sichon, which is the story of the second generation. And the parallel language is very striking. But for our purposes, the main point is this, that unlike what you have in the book of Bamidbar, where the people, I said the people send the message to Sichon. And actually, by the way, it's very interesting. If you remember back in Bamidbar, the message to Edom was first sent by Moshe, by Yishlach Moshe Malachim. Moshe says, we'll go through your land, we won't eat anything, we won't take anything, we'll walk straight through, walk on the king's highway. It's exactly the message that the people send to Sichon. But in the story of Edom, after Edom responds and says, you're not coming through lest I attack you, it sounds like then Israel, not Moshe, Israel on their own, they sent the second message. Listen, it won't be the king's highway. There'll be some side roads. Yes, of course, we'll eat and drink, but we'll pay you for it. It's not a big deal. We'll do it as quietly as possible. Because they're afraid, because if Israel goes through, it sounds like they are allies of Israel. And they don't want that, which is understandable. But then the message to Sichon, though, was not Moshe. Moshe is not mentioned. Nor does it sound like a very conciliatory message. Please let us through. Na'abra can mean we will pass through. It can mean please, or it can mean we're passing through. We're not taking anything. We're just going to go through. And Sichon may hear this as a kind of ultimatum. So that's an interesting point. But the point is that over here, when Moshe retells the story, before there's any war with Sichon, God says, I'm going to, you could go ahead and start up with them. Go ahead and fight them. That's God speaking. Now, you might say, what is the difference between these two stories? And the difference could be the following. The question is, how does one understand the status of Eva Hayarden before Israel crosses over? What is the status? What is this land? Is this the land of Israel? Or is it not the land of Israel? And therein lies a very big question. Whether you're studying the book of Bamidbar, that's a very interesting question. And I don't think the answer is a simple answer. But I think let's start by saying, one could make the argument that the land which they took, and they take the land because they're trying to get to the other side. So as a practical matter, they got to pass through someplace. So as a practical matter, they fought, but that land, given the fact that it's not on the right side of the Jordan River, is not really fully the land of Israel. It's captured land. They have the right to keep it, but it's not the land of Israel. Now, if you take that position, that's not the land of Israel, we understand another story in the book of Bamidbar, which, of course, is retold very differently in Sefer Devarim. And the story I'm referring to, of course, is the story of Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain. Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain go to Moshe in chapter 32 of Bamidbar, and they say to Moshe, let's take a look at that in Bamidbar chapter 32. Bamidbar 32, we're told the following. We're told, "Umikne Rav hayal livnei Ruvain v'livnei Gad atzum ma'od, vayiru et Eretz Yazer v'et Eretz Gilad v'nei ha'makom makom mikneh." So we're told that Ruvain and Gad had a lot of cattle. Atzum ma'od, great amount of cattle. And they saw the land of Yazer and Gilad. That's the land that was captured in the battle of the Ever HaYarden. And lo and behold, it's a good place for cattle. And therefore, Vayovo b'nei Gad u'bnei Ruvain, Vayamru el Moshe v'yo Elazar Kohen, v'yo Nisiei ha'edol Lemar. So b'nei Gad and Ruvain go before Moshe and the priest and the heads of the tribes, and they say the following. Atarot v'divon v'yazer v'nimra v'cheshbon v'yelolei Savam u'nevo u'va'on. These are all cities in the Ever HaYarden. Haaretz asher hika Hashem l'fnei adat Yisrael eretz miknehi. The land which God allowed or caused to be given over to the congregation of Israel is a very good land for cattle. V'la'avodecha mikneh. And we have cattle. And then there's a parsha, there's a stop. And the next verse is, Vayomru, they said, Imatzanu chen b'yeinecha, Yutane ta'aretz azot la'avodecha la'chuzah, Al tavi reina v'tayarden. They said, if we find favor in your eyes, let this land be given to your servants as a possession, achuzah. Don't bring us across the Jordan. So the request is actually very interesting. And I think probably we've all experienced something like this in our own lives. The question is this: what do they think of this request? Or what do they think Moshe is going to think of this request? And notice that when they come to Moshe and the others, they don't say, give us the land right away. They say something very different. Look at this land. What a wonderful place for cattle. And by the way, we have a lot of cattle. And what the hoping is that Moshe will say, you know what? Why don't you just stay here? It's a perfect land for you. You have cattle. It's good land for grazing cattle. But instead, there's a parsha and there's no response. And therefore, Vayomru, they said, the same people are speaking, but the Torah introduces it with Vayomru, and often that's when a reply was hoped for or anticipated, but not forthcoming. And now they're forced directly to ask, give us this land. Don't bring us across the Jordan. Now the question is how Moshe responds to this request. And one can respond in a variety of ways. But of course, one of the issues is the status of the land. In other words, if this land is the land of Israel, so the request at least makes some sense. The land of Israel will be divided up according to the tribes, and this is the most fitting land for us. So give us this land. If, on the other hand, the land of Israel is actually on the other side of the Jordan, then what they're requesting, in effect, is permission not to enter the land of Israel. The entire mission was framed in terms of I'm taking them out of Egypt and to bring them into the land of Canaan, into the good and broad land, etc., etc. The boundaries of which were given elsewhere, and it didn't include, presumably, the Ever Hayarden. So that's one issue over here. Moshe raises a different issue, but this issue is also there, sort of beneath the surface, and we have to remember here. I'm just trying to put forward the complexity of this issue. It's not a simple matter. Who is making the request? So the request comes from two tribes, Ruvain and Gad. Now we have to remember that in the Torah, when they're traveling in the desert, the 12 tribes travel in the desert in groups of 3. The Levium are actually separate. The Levium dwell separately around the Mishkan, and the other 12 tribes are divided into 4 groups of 3. Each group has a group leader. Reuven and Gad travel together in the desert. Reuven is the group leader, which makes sense. Reuven is the firstborn. So we have to assume then, if Gad and Reuven and Gad come to Moshe, that the primary actor, the primary one who's complaining, is actually Reuven. And Reuven, the way the Torah works, maybe the whole Bible works this way, certain kinds of typologies. Reuven is the eldest son, who was deprived of the Bechorah, and he's the one perhaps who might have been the main inheritor of Jacob, but because of his behavior, including the sleeping with Bilhah, but not only that, he has demonstrated that his leadership qualities are not very good. I mean, he may have the right idea in mind, may have a good soul, but his leadership qualities are very poor. So he's not going to be the leader. The leadership is passed over to Joseph as the Bechor and to Yehuda as the leader. And when you read the story of Reuven in Sefer Breshit, and we are presently reading, of course, in Shul, there's another character who reminds us very much of Reuven, someone who might have been Abraham's successor, but at the end of the day, he is not, and his behavior is very suggestive as to why he's actually passed over. And of course, that's Abraham's nephew, Lot. Lot is accompanies Abraham on the journey, but Lot is not going to be the one to take Abraham's place, to be Abraham's covenantal successor. And the story of Lot that sort of seals it for us. Lot travels to Sodom, and in Sodom, he, of course, demonstrates the hospitality of Abraham. He's Abraham-like in that sense, but he also offers his daughters to the Sodomites. And when he's told to leave Sodom, he has trouble leaving Sodom. Vayitma'ama, he tarries, he delays. He has to be dragged out. And even after he's dragged out and told to go back to the mountain, he fails to do so. Now, I was thinking that actually Reuven, in the story over here, and Lot have a lot in common. In other words, the point is, when Reuven says, I want to stay on this side because of the cattle, that's one factor. But the way the Torah seems to frame it, it's more like he really can't get out of Egypt. He's really, in a certain sense, stuck in Egypt. And when you read this, we can't get into this in full, but when you read chapter 32, verse number 1, Miknei Rav Hayol Livnei Reuven Livnei Gad Otzum Ma'od. You have this expression. It recalls the beginning of the book of Shemot. Ne'am b'nei Yisrael Rav Yotzum Mimenu. And the language here of Egypt, it's that Reuven represents the inability to cross over. And the one who picks this up, that what it's really about, and the problem is the inability to cross over, is none other than Moshe Rabbeinu in the book of Bamidbar. Because what Moshe says to them when they make this request, Moshe has the following: to say he gets angry would be an understatement. The first thing he says is, "Ha'chechem yovo lamilchama v'atem teshvu po." What? They're going to go fight on the other side, and you're going to sit grazing the cows? That doesn't seem very right to me. After all, the land that was captured, the Torah suggests, was captured by, yes, with God's assistance, but everybody fought. And now you want to say they should fight, and we're going to stay over here? So Moshe's first argument is the inequity of saying others should fight, and I'm going to do something else. He puts it in terms of a rhetorical question, so obvious to him that that's wrong. I mean, it makes no sense. He says, what? Is that what you mean? That can't, not possible. How would anybody think such a thought? Others should fight, and I'm going to do something else. That for Moshe is an impossibility, a logical impossibility, an ethical impossibility, of course. But then he goes on to something else. The bulk of Moshe's speech is about something else. Lama tini'un et leiv b'nei Yisrael. Moshe goes in a long description over here. When we studied Bamidbar, I talked about this at length. What does Moshe say? You are the Meraglim. That's what Moshe says. You are the Meraglim. That's what your ancestors did. I took them out of Egypt. I sent them into the land. They came back, and they dissuaded everybody else from possessing the land. And that's who you are. You are the Meraglim. In other words, what Moshe is saying is, the Meraglim, that was the first generation. Those were the spies who dissuaded that. But we move forward. We're now in the 40th year. This is the second generation. Everybody seems to have moved forward, except for you. You're still in the same place. And that's not acceptable. He actually accuses them of being the Meraglim, and he says that the Meraglim was not just that they themselves questioned God's plan, but through their speech, they caused everybody else to also question God's plan. And that's what he accuses them of. He goes on and on over here. He says, for example, God got angry, except for Kalev and Yoshua in verse number 12. In verse 13, God was angry. Vayicharaf Hashem b'Yisrael, vayiniyem ba'midbar 40 shana, atom kohador, hoseh hara b'yenei Hashem. And then verse 14, v'nei kamtem tachat avotechem, tabut anoshim. You stand instead of in the place of the Meraglim. Lispos od al charon af Hashem Yisrael. You will destroy this people, he says. You've turned back from God, and you will cause calamity. That's Moshe's accusation. So Moshe's accusation is, we got to move forward over here, and instead you're moving backwards. In other words, the way I framed it is, you're still in Egypt. You're still the generation that couldn't get out of Mitzrayim. The first generation, the sin of the Meraglim. What did the people say when the Meraglim spoke to them? Nidna rosh v'nashuva Mitzrayim. We are, let's go back to Egypt. So therefore, I think one can read the story of Reuven and God is, it's not just, of course, the idea that others fight in a war and I don't participate. That for Moshe that's obviously completely unacceptable and totally immoral. That's we say pshita, of course, that's obvious. But the point is, but the other point is that you're still in Egypt. Now this makes perfect sense if you assume that the land of the Eva HaYarden is not fully Israel. Because they would say, what do you mean? We're not in Egypt. Here we are. We've come to Israel. This is the land. This is the conquest. But no, but Moshe's argument is much more powerful if we assume, yes, this is the land we've captured. Yes, we can keep the land, but this is not the land of Israel. So this is the question, actually, when you're studying Bamidbar, how one views the Eva HaYarden, and not just when you're studying Bamidbar, even in terms of some of the rabbinic texts. It's actually very interesting. What is the status of Eva HaYarden? The Tanaim have disputes about this, actually, what the status is. Now, what the status is has two parts to it. It could be what is the status before the land of Israel was conquered, and then what is the status after the land of Israel is captured? Because one can make that distinction. One could say until you conquer the entire land, the land here doesn't have the full status of Israel. But once you do conquer the whole land, then at that point, from that point on, and maybe even retroactively, this land becomes part and parcel of the land of Israel. That's a very interesting question. But in any event, my point is when you read this and you read the story, you get the sense that Eva HaYarden is not fully Israel. On the other hand, going back to chapter 21, just before the war against Sichon, we have a few verses just before the war against the Sichon, which is chapter 21, verse 21. We started with that. But just before that, we have 2 or 3 verses about a song that Israel sings called Shirat HaBe'er. Oz Yashir Yisrael in verse number 17. Israel sang a song, Ali Be'er Enulah. We have this little poem, this little song called Shirat HaBe'er. Maybe for those who studied together here Bamidbar, you remember that we spoke at some length about the function of the song. And that songs, at least this song and the Song of the Sea, are also markers. The Song of the Sea is a marker. It marks the end of this being slaves in Egypt and the beginning of the journey through the desert. And the Song of the Well, Shirat HaBe'er, is a marker. It marks, in a sense, the end of the journey through the desert and now the beginning of the conquest of the land. So one way to form, there's what one I think takes from Shirat HaBe'er is that in some sense, this is the beginning of the conquest. Now, that doesn't mean that the status of this land presently is a full status. The only point that I'm making is it's actually somewhat complex over here. But fundamentally, I think one can make the argument that fundamentally, the land of Sichon is not fully the land of Israel, and therefore, Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven's request is very problematic. That's as far as the book of Bamidbar is concerned. And now let's turn our attention to the book of Devarim. But before I do that, let me just stop and take any comments or questions, and then we'll get to Sefer Devarim's take on the war against Sichon. Yes, please speak up, whoever.
If I hear everything that you're saying, but if you had made that comment that if they conquer a giant, that's a signifier that God is helping them, right?
Yes.
So they conquered Og, and he was on that side. So that indicates that Hashem wants to conquer that land. He wants them to have that indeed.
Well, I think they can distinguish between wanting to have the land, maybe to have the land, but that doesn't necessarily mean that this is the land of Israel. they've got to pass through in one way or the other. When it comes to the other, of course, in Bamidbar it only mentions Esav, but when it comes to Esav, we don't. The book of Bamidbar, it seems like a practical matter. Esav brings an army out, and we're not going to fight with them. When it comes to Sichon, maybe because Israel is getting a little fed up with all these delays, so Israel will fight. And then when it comes to Og, it's true. God says, "Don't be afraid. You'll defeat them." Doesn't necessarily mean that this is the land of Israel. And when we read the book of Devarim, we'll see it's very different. Moshe has a completely different take. But we'll see that in a moment. But there's no question they defeat them, they keep the land. That's true. The question is, what is the status of it? And what I'm pointing out is that one can read the story in Bamidbar and say, as a practical matter, they had these wars. But this is not necessarily part of this divine plan. You could read it that way, and if you do read it that way, then the great anger against Reuven and God that Moshe displays is clear. Moshe is the one who has one request in his whole life: let me
To
cross
go
over
in.
to the other side. And God says, no, basically, you can't. It's not going to happen. So we understand people that actually could cross over and decide not to would not necessarily, Moshe wouldn't find favorable with such a request. Apart from the other issue of the unfairness of not fighting, that bothers him. That's the first thing he says. But that's obvious to him. But again, once again, if my point is, you can read it this way. And I point Shirat Aber suggests that this is the beginning of the conquest, actually. So I'm saying there's a certain complexity to it. But if I had to pick sides, I would say that in the book of Bamidbar, it's not necessarily l'chadchila, I would say. This isn't part of the plan. As a practical matter, you got to get through. And Sichon actually attacks Israel. Israel issued this statement. You can read it as a kind of ultimatum, but it's kind of Sichon attacks us, so we fight back. And having captured the land, it's our land. But not necessarily this is part of the plan to begin with. We'll see that Devarim, I think, is very different. In Devarim, this is the plan, actually, but as we will see. Anybody else? Comments, questions?
Yes.
Yeah.
Rabbi Silber, the manner in which they speak, which is very humble and almost beseeching Moshe Rabbeinu, indicates their divided state of mind also, just as you spoke about it, that they know that they are chickening out a little bit, and there's a hesitation in the way they approach the matter.
Right. Let's put it this way: they know that. Strikes me. They know that they're asking something that the other people are not going to be very very happy about. They certainly know that. On the other hand, they do make the request, and I think Moshe sees the request as extraordinarily problematic. He also assumes, now Moshe assumes that their intention was not to fight. The claim that they make, the claim that Reuven makes in chapter 32, we never meant that. We never meant we're not going to fight. That's what they say in chapter 32. You misunderstand us. Let us clarify. Of course, we're going to fight. But after we fight, we want this to be our land. And then Moshe says, okay, then let's make a formal agreement. That's what chapter 32 is. And Moshe says, okay, if in fact you do fight, they sign a contract. It's very interesting that agreement between Moshe and Bnei Reuven and God in chapter 32, after Reuven and God clarified, we never meant that in the first place. Then Moshe makes a formal agreement, which is chapter 32, beginning in verse number 20. Verse number 20, if you do this, if you go across and the land is captured, you come back. And if you don't do it, that becomes the basis in the Talmud. It's actually very interesting. And that conversation of Moshe and the tribes becomes the basis in the Talmud of a very important legal concept called Tanai, condition. The Talmud assumes in general you can attach conditions to your statement. I will do X if if Y happens. A man gives money to the woman. You are married to me if it rains tomorrow. So if it rains tomorrow, they're married. If it doesn't rain tomorrow, they're not married. And conditions apply across the board, not just to marriage, all kinds of business deals. You can attach conditions. And the Talmud implicitly asks the question, maybe even explicitly, who says you can add conditions? And if you do add conditions, are there any legal parameters to conditions? That's the whole sugi. Rabbi Meir and through the whole shas actually require what's called a t'nai kafel. If X will happen, then Y, and if X will not happen, then not Y. That's the way t'nai has to be formulated. The source of all t'nai is the story in chapter 32 of Bamidbar of the agreement between Moshe and Bnei Reuven and Bnei Gad. So it's seen as like a contract. It's a formal agreement. Moshe draws up a formal agreement. And that itself might suggest that he wants to make sure that this is very clear, that the conditions are very clear. If you fight, yes. If you don't fight, no. Now, the very fact that he draws it up that way might suggest to us that Moshe is not fully convinced that that was their initial intention. Let me digress for a minute or two, and just since this comes up and you raise the question about, and the question is, I think, implicit in any event about Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, and we'll touch upon this when we get to Dvarim in a couple of minutes. But actually, was that their initial intention? They say it was, but was it? Because they didn't put that in, they didn't mention it initially. Listen, the land is good for cattle. We have cattle. Give us the land. What? They're going to fight? You're not going to fight with them? Oh, no. We didn't mean that. Of course not. Who would ever think such a crazy idea? But what were they thinking? And what's very interesting is, in this context, if I may digress for a couple of moments, just there is a story, not in the Torah, but in the book of Yoshua, since it raised this question. In chapter, I believe it's chapter 30, chapter 22 of Yoshua, towards the very end of Sefer Yoshua. Now, in Sefer Yoshua, Bnei Reuven and Bnei Gad do fulfill the condition. They do fight, and they seem to be sort of leading the fight even. Chalutzim, they're sort of the leaders of the fight. So they fulfilled their promise, and that's very clear. That's how the book even begins. Yoshua says to them, remember the promise that you made to Moshe, and not just to Moshe, but to all of Israel. And they say, yes, we will do exactly as we said, and they do. And then you have Yoshua chapter 22. Remember the story, what happens in chapter 22. They have fulfilled their condition. Now they're going to go cross back over the Jordan and return to their families and the cattle and the wives who have stayed behind while the fight was going on. And when they go back, Reuven and Gad and half the tribe of Manasseh. We haven't got to that yet, because Moshe added half the tribe of Manasseh. And when they go back, they what they do is they build a big altar. They build a big altar, and they this is found in Joshua chapter 22. They build a big altar. Verse number 10. Mizbeach gadol l'mareh. They build an altar. It's so big you can see it from every place. It's a gigantic altar. And what happens when Israel sees the altar that Bnei Gad and Reuven and half of Manasseh built? What do? Do you remember? They decide to go to war against them.
They're furious.
They are furious and they decide to go to war. They're going to go to war. Why are they going to go to war? Because they're assuming that what Reuven, Gad, and Manasseh have done, essentially, is to create a separate nation. That the other side of the Jordan is going to be it's a different country. They've cut all their ties to Israel. They have seceded from the Union. So they go to the central place of worship at Shiloh, and they get together, and they say we have to go to war against these people. They've seceded from the union. They have their own temple. The temple is the great unifier, and they build their own mizbeach. So they decide. They send messages. They send messages to the to Reuven and Gad and Manasseh. What have you done? You have trespassed against the God of Israel. What is this? It's a long discussion. I'm not going to get into that right now. Maybe we'll touch base later upon this, about the letter that they send, the message that they send to Reuven and Gad. But Reuven and Gad answer them at the end of chapter 22, in verse number 20, I think it's verse 21. God forbid, God forbid, God forbid, God forbid. They say, no, 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 you misunderstand. That's not our intention. Of course not. We're not turning away from God. We're not establishing our own country. It's the opposite. Because when our children grow up on the other side of the Jordan, they're going to say, "What's your connection to the rest of Israel? To those people on the other side of the Jordan? What's your connection?" And we're going to show them the altar, the Mizbeach. We worship the same God. We're part of the same nation. And Israel hears this, and they accept the explanation of Reuven and Gad, and there is no civil war. That's the story that appears at the very end of chapter 22 of Sefer Yoshua. Really, then before Yoshua gathers them together and makes a new covenant, this is the story. So when you read that story, I think we all ask ourselves the question, here we have these people, let's say Reuven and Gad. This is the second time that somebody assumes something about them, and they say, no, 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 that we never intended that. What are you talking about? The opposite. Of course not. Of course not. This is the opposite. This is to demonstrate that our solidarity and our connectedness. And Moshe says, what, they're going to fight? We never meant that. Of course not. Of course we intend to fight. And now the question, I think what the Torah wants to leave us with, and Yoshua too, really? Is that the case? Somebody's always misunderstood. There's usually a reason why they're always misunderstood. So the point is, I think what the Torah has done over here, so Moshe doesn't believe it. And he makes sure that afterwards there is a real commitment, and he makes it clear. And if you don't do it, you're not getting it. He emphasizes that. If you don't cross, you're not getting it. So my point about the story of B'nai Gad and B'nai Reuven in Bamidbar, in any event, I think the Torah wants to raise a question without giving us the answer. But the question is was that really your intention? Or is Moshe actually sort of straightening them out? And I think there's other evidence, which I can't get into now, that Moshe actually is actually straightening them out, that their thinking is off. And Moshe puts his foot down and makes it clear that this is not right. But if you do want to keep this part of the land for yourselves, then only under the following conditions. And that becomes very clear in Sefer Yoshua as well. The first chapter of Yoshua, he says to Reuven and Gad, you have to lead the fight. You have to cross over in front, because that's the promise that you made. When somebody keeps reminding you of the promise that you made, then usually it means that they're not so sure that you remember the promise that you made, and maybe you want to forget it. So I think that's a very, very interesting point about how the Torah works in general. And just one last point before we jump to Dvarim. The chapter 32 begins that Reuven and Gad had a lot of cattle. We have no idea why Reuven and Gad would have more cattle than anybody else. We have no idea. Why would they have so much cattle? But what's actually quite interesting, what's quite interesting is that in the previous chapter, chapter 31, in the war against Midian, it's a long chapter, and it describes all the booty that was taken from the Midianites, including vast amounts of cattle, which means everybody's got a lot of cattle. Maybe they have a little more, but the Torah goes out of its way in a long chapter, 31, to describe all of the mikneh, which the tribes divide equally. There's no reason to assume that Reuven and Gad got more of the spoils, the flocks, etc., than anybody else. And that itself, I think, poses another question. Okay, you've got a lot of cattle. You've got 1 million herds. There's 725,000 herds. Everybody's got cattle. Why are you so special? You have a lot of cattle. So I think the Torah is implicitly raising a lot of questions about the status of the land, about Reuven and God. And one thing is that Moshe certainly doesn't trust them. That's for sure. See why he works out a deal. That as far as Bamidbar is concerned. Now let's turn our attention to Sefer Devarim. And as we see so often, it's another story. It's another story completely. Let's just turn to our chapter. Okay, let's just do that, and I'll stop and take more comments and questions. Okay, let's take a look. Let's see, where are we here? Chapter 2, the end of chapter 2. Let's see. Let me get Devarim here. Okay, 1 second, please. Yeah. Okay. Chapter 2. Now we have the following. God says, Kumus Sa'ul, chapter 2, verse 24. Kumus, up to this point, you can't take Edom, you can't take Ammon, you can't take Moab, it's their land. Kumus Sa'ul v'yivru nachar non, Ri'enu atati biyarchot sichon mel cheshbon lemori v'yet artso, ochel rosh, v'yitgar bo milchama. Hayom hazeh ochel teipachtecha v'yiratcha al pnei hamim, etc. The verses that we started with this morning. So what is God saying? God says, they haven't sent any messages to Sichon. God says, I have begun, you shall now begin to possess the land. And what is the beginning of possession of the land? The war against Sichon. So here in Devarim, it's not, you got to get to the other side somehow, you got to pass through, No. It sounds like this is, from the very beginning, part of the plan. Says God, start trouble with them. Hit garbo milchama. Start up with them. And this is going to be the beginning of the conquest, and beginning of the conquest from a psychological standpoint, because we know when we read the book of Yoshua, this is what people remember. In fact, the book of Devarim begins that way. The 40th year, Acharei Hakoto et Sichon Melech Rasheo Aviet Og Melech HaBashan. The book of Devarim begins by mentioning Sichon and Og. So here it's not, here God has already said. And now we have the following in verse number 26, chapter 2, verse 26. For Shemach Malachim Mimidbar Kedemot El Sichon Melech Heshbon Divrei Shalom. Moshe says, I sent messengers to Sichon, words of peace. Now, in the book of Bamidbar, Moshe does not send messengers to Sichon. Israel sends messengers to Sichon. And they're not really words of peace either. We're going through. Ebra bi'artzecha, baderech elech lo asu yaminu smol, ochel bakesef tashbireni v'yochalti, umayim bakesef titen li v'shotiti, rak ebra b'raglai, kasher asu li b'nei Esav hayoshvim b'seir, v'yamoavim hayoshvim ba'or, ad asher evoret hayarden el haaretz, asher Hashem Eloheinu notenu lanu. Moshe says, listen, we want to pass through, do what the others did. We purchased food from them, from the Moabites and from Esav. Of course, the Torah in the book of Bamidbar suggested nothing of the sort, as I mentioned last week. Just so we want to pass through, do like the others did. We're gonna take food, we're gonna drink, we're gonna pay you, no problem. Words of peace. But Sichon, Melech Heshbon Havirenu Bo. But says Moshe, the king, Sichon, the king of Heshbon, did not allow us to pass through. Why not? Ki hiksha Hashem Elokecha et rucho, v'yimetzet levavo, l'man tito b'yodcha kayom hazeh, because God hardened his heart. Hardening of the heart. Of course, we're all familiar with this from the story of Paro. That was God's plan. God said explicitly, I'm going to multiply the miracles. They will know that I am God. And Moshe uses exactly the same language when it comes to Sichon. This is part of the divine plan. This is not something that just happens to happen. God has already said, I want you to possess the land of Sichon. So when you read that, one gets the sense that this is part of the land. This is part of the plan. So when B'nai Gad and B'nai Reuven will say, we want to stay on this side, leaving out the question of not fighting, which of course is immoral, obviously, but leave that out. But in terms of are they rejecting the land of Israel? The answer is no. They're not rejecting the land of Israel. Not at all. So now we have the war against Sichon, the battle against Sichon. And Sichon goes out to fight. And Vayitneu Hashem Eloheinu Lefanenu, says Moshe, and God enabled us to defeat Sichon, right? And we captured the cities, etc. Goes on with this. And then we captured the land. We did not enter the part of anything approaching the land of Ammon, right? Ammon, we're not allowed to take Ammon's land. And now we move to chapter 3. And we have chapter 3, Vanathan Vanal Derech HaBashan. We're traveling northerly towards the Bashan. Vayetzeog Melech HaBashan Likratenu, Hu v'chol Amon HaMelchama Edrei. So he and his people came to a place called Edrei. And once again, Vayomer Hashem Elai Al Tiroto. Don't be afraid. With Og, you have to be afraid. Og is a giant, so there's reason to be afraid. Says God, don't be afraid. You'll defeat him the way you defeated Sichon. Yes, I will give him his people to you and the land. The same way at Kasher Asito Sichon Melch Emori Asher Yoshev B'Cheshbon. So the point is that, once again, God is saying, have no fear, and more than that, this land will be your land. This is your land. This is part of the divine plan. And Moshe then describes the land that's taken. We can skip over a few verses. And let's go to chapter 3, verse number 8. Chapter 3, verse number 8. Vanikach ba'et ahi et haaretz biyad shnei malcheo emori asher b'yever hayarden minachal Arnon ad Har Chemon. Fine. Now, I want to make one other point about this before I just say something briefly about Reuven and God. And that is that when you read the book of Devarim, more than Bamidbar, there's really explicit that the kings that were defeated by Israel, Sichon and Og, are actually Amori. It's mentioned in one place in Bamidbar, but here it's emphasized. You took the land, Miyad Shnei Malcheo Emori. I think the reason for the emphasis that Sichon and Og are Amorite kings is because in the covenant that's made with Abraham, back in Sefer Bereshit, in the Brit Ben Habitarim, God said, the fourth generation shall possess the land, Ki lo shalem avon ha'emori adhena. For until then, the sin of the Amori is not full. I can't dispossess the Amori yet because the time has not come to be dispossessed. And God refers to the people who live in the land of Israel. Usually in the Bible, it's the Canaanites, Eretz Canaan. But in a few places, it's Eretz Amori. In the covenant with Abraham, the fourth generation shall return to the land. You have to wait. Kilo Shalem Avono Emori. So actually, if you think about it, when you read those verses now, from where we're sitting, the fourth generation what is the fourth generation? The fourth generation for Israel is the generation that grows up in the desert. The Jews who leave Egypt are the third generation, right? After the death of Yosef and his brothers, Yosef Hadar, and then you have after Levi dies, the son is Kahat, generation number 1 of suffering. Then you have Amram, is generation 2, and Moshe and Aaron, generation 3. Moses is a third generation Jew in Egypt. His people are third generation Jews. They die in the desert. The fourth generation are the new generation about to enter the land, the Dar Rivi'i. The Dar Rivi'i Yoshuvu Hena, said God. Kilo Shalem Avona Emori Adhena. In other words, the defeat of the Amori is the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham to possess the land. So from that perspective, Sichon and Og, Ever Hayarden, is part of the land. Not just part of the land, it's actually the beginning of the covenantal fulfillment. That's why I believe why in the book of Devarim is a big emphasis on the Amori. Sichon and Og Melech, you took it from the two Amorite kings. And having said all this, let me make one more comment, and I'll stop and take comments and questions. Now we come to Reuven and Gad. And here's what's interesting. Reuven and Gad, it's end of chapter 3, verse number, let me see, verse number 13, I believe, 19, verse number 19. Let me get my glasses on to see this again. Verse number 18. Verse number 18. Chapter 3, verse 18. Hashem Elohechem natan lachem et haaretz hazot l'mishta chalutzim tavru l'fnei achechem b'nei Yisrael kol b'nei chayo rak tabchem. Actually, let me just back up a bit. Back to verse number 12. V'et haaretz hazot, verse 12. Let's start with chapter 3, verse 12. V'et haaretz hazot yorashnu b'ei, all of this land, the land of Sichon and Og, we possessed at that time. Me'aroer asher al nachal arnon v'chatzi haragilad v'yarav notati u'uveni v'lagodi v'yeter hagilad v'chol habashan mamlechet Og notati lachatzi shevet hamnasher chol chevel argov v'chol habashan ahu yikarei eretz Rephaim. Says Moshe, at that time, after we defeated Sichon and Og, I gave the land to Reuven and to Gad and half the tribe of Manasseh. Now, I'll deal with Manasseh in the next session, about the half tribe of Manasseh. But what is missing in our story? Now we jump to verse 18. It describes different parts of the Eivra Yarden that Reuven and Gad and Manasseh possess. And then in verse number 19, I command you at that time, God has given you this land to possess. Chalutzim ta'avru l'fnei achechem b'nei Yisrael kol b'nei chayo. Rak nishechem v'tapchem miknechem yodati yimikne rav lachem yeshvu b'yorechem asher notati lachem ad asher yaniach Hashem lachechem b'chem kochem v'yashu gam hem et haaretz asher Hashem Elohechem notenu lachem b'yever hayarden v'shavtem ish lirushato asher notati lahem. Says Moshe, at that time, I commanded Reuven and Gad and Manasseh, saying, listen, I give you this land. You will, of course, go before your brethren and fight with them as great warriors. You can leave the women back and the children and the cattle. I know you have a lot of cattle. You have a lot of cattle. I understand it. And after that was over, you will return to your land. What is missing over here in Devarim chapter 3? Conspicuously absent is the entire conversation in chapter 32 of Bamidbar between Moshe and the other leaders and Reuven and Gad. Moshe has a long, angry speech. You are betraying the people. You are the Meraglim. What? You're not taking responsibility. What? You're not fighting with the others. That's conspicuously missing over here. On the contrary, Moshe is arranging everything. I'm giving you the land. Of course, you're going to go fight with the others. There's no conversation. There's no contract over here. And I think that's actually related, and that's not true not only over here. We'll see that elsewhere in the book, actually. Moshe seems to have a very, very different view towards Bnei Reuven and Bnei Gad as far as this is concerned. In fact, in the blessings at the end of Sefer Devarim in Zot HaBracha, he extols Bnei Gad. It sounds like he actually praises them for possessing land on the other side of the Jordan. So if that be the case, and I think it is the case, it's night and day difference. It's saying something very different over here, and it's all connected. This is the beginning, the possession of the land. Moshe says, if you had only Devarim, Moshe says, you know something, I have a good idea. You have a lot of cattle. Why don't you stay over here? You have so much cattle. Of course, you're going to go fight and lead the battle, obviously. But you take this land, leave your cattle here. The rest of the family, the non-combatants, leave over here, and we'll come back later. And it's Moshe's idea. There's no sense whatsoever that Reuven and Gad have raised any issue. Sounds like Moshe's saying, I know you have a lot of cattle. So the question is, when you read the Devarim, are you reading it together with Bamidbar? Of course, we have to read it together. But my point is, do you try to reconcile them? Or do you say, it's a completely different take? This is Moshe's take. And Moshe's take is, no, there's no problem. There's no problem because this is the land of Israel. Someone's got to be here. Someone's got to possess it. Might as well be you because you have cattle. So it's actually very interesting how Moshe's, it's very interesting in general. You have two stories. I mean, to some extent, we do this all the time, at least in these classes, all the time. You read one story. I'll give you an example. God says to Noah, I plan to destroy the world. Why don't you get your family together, build this big ark, take a sample of all the various animals, bring them to the ark, etc., and sail off into the sunset, because I'm going to kill everybody else. And what does Noah do? He builds the ark. In the words of the Torah, he does all that God commanded him to do. It says it twice. There's no statement to God. Sounds like he starts right away to build the ark. Then you read another story. You read the story in Sefer Shemot. God says to Moshe, listen, these people are hopeless. I'm going to get rid of them. I'll build a new nation through you. And then Moshe says, you can't do that. What about these people? What about the promises you made? How's it going to look for you, etc., etc., etc.? And when you read that second story, and we study that story, you see immediately that the language of that story plays off the story of Noah. Plays off the Noah story. Vayichal Moshe. It plays off the story of the language, plays off Noah. And the question is what to make of that. In other words, are we now rereading the Noah story? Are we seeing that it's a different approach? So it's not identical to what I'm talking about. It's an analog, but it's very similar. And that's how the Bible works. The Bible is constantly retelling stories, changing stories, all kinds of nuance. And the question is, to what degree one now reads the first story differently? And to what degree do we say we have a variety of, we have story number A, we have story number B, we have story B which plays off A, maybe we have story A once we read B, but we also have story A by itself. This is the complicating factor. In any event, over here, when it comes to Sefer Devarim, the approach of these sessions has been and will be to look at this book as a separate book, a separate take. It's someone looking back at the past and saying, I have a different way to understand the past. And we do this all the time, of course, in our own lives. We think of our own lives, and given where we are at any present moment, we read the past very differently. We do this all the time. And I find that extremely interesting. The idea that we have in our 5 books of Moses a book which tells a totally different story. Every story is different. That's very interesting. It's sort of, one might say, it's presented as the words of Moses. It's sort of presented from a kind of human dimension. It's saying, this is how this person, Moshe, this is how Moshe sees it. So this is, and we include this in the 5 books. Some would say it's the beginning of what we call Torah Shebaal Peh. It's the beginning of the acts of the Torah Shebaal Peh, which actually reinterprets, sometimes radically reinterprets the Torah. And we have within the Torah itself a book which seems to reinterpret, or at least to put out there, one man's view of what happened. Yes, the one man happens to be Moshe Rabbeinu, or Kam Navi Moshe. At the end of the day, he's one man. And the book of Devarim makes that very clear. He's one man with his limitations, and one man with his sense of tragedy, as it were. And but anyway, we'll get to that piece of it. But I want to point this out. The two things I think are very connected: how you view Bnei Reuven and Bnei Gad, and how you view the Ever Hayarden, are presumably deeply connected. And let me stop and take some comments and questions at this point. Anybody, any comments or questions about about all of this, because we'll touch upon a little bit next week with Menashe, and then we'll continue with Voet Hanan, Moshe's request to enter the land, and chapter 4. Chapter 5 begins a new part of Sefer Devarim, but I certainly want to finish in these sessions that we have before we take a break and continue. I want to see if we can certainly get up to chapter 5. The first 4 chapters are their own separate unit. If anybody have any comments or questions at this point?
Rabbi Silber,
Yeah.
could you elaborate a little bit on the parallel between Noach's story and Moshe Rabbeinu when he's told that God
Yes.
will wipe out the people? Could you
Yes,
give a
I mean,
little more detail?
the 2 stories are parallel in the sense in each of those 2 stories, God says, I will destroy everybody else, and I will build the world through you. That's what God says to Noah, and that is what happens. Noah is building a new world. He is also a link to the old world. So I don't think Noah is a piece of the old world that can continue in the future. But the world that Noah creates, in many senses, is very different from that first creation. His relationship to the world is different. God's expectations of the human are very different. The idea of responsibility, that we have responsibility to govern the so-called 7 mitzvot of Noah. The Chumash doesn't have 7, but the Chumash does have a sense that we are now responsible for the world. When it comes to Moshe, after the golden calf, God says, if leave me alone, just leave me here, and I will destroy them, and I'll build a nation through you. I'll get rid of Israel. They're a hopeless bunch. Make a golden calf. Having stood at Sinai, they made a golden calf 40 days later, and forget them. I will make the nation through you. And then we have Moshe on the mountain in the book of Shemot argues with God. You can't do that. Such as Vayichal Moshe. Moshe entreats. The word Vayichal is a very interesting word because the word Vayichal, Vayichal, comes up several times. Comes up rarely in the Torah, but it comes up at least 3 times, 3 or 4 times when it comes to Moshe. Vayochel Noach ish adamah. Vayochel Shivat sends out the raven and the dove. Vayochel. So the point is, the God's statement. Now, does God really want to destroy Israel? Not really, because God says to Moshe, if you leave me alone, I'm going to destroy them, which Moshe takes to mean, I'm not going to leave you alone. Hanicholi. Even the word Hanicha plays with Noach. There are all kinds of plays with Noach, right? Vayinachem Hashem. Why is Noah called Noach? Say Yinachamenu Mima'asenu. There are all kinds of literary connections between the story of Moshe and Noach. And remember, when Moshe was first born, his mother puts him inside a little teva, a little ark. So there are all kinds of Moshe and Noach connections in Sefer Shemot from the very beginning. But the point of the Chumash is to recall the Noach story and to say, when Moshe is taking a different path. Now, when you look at these 2 stories, you say, why does Moshe take a different path? Is it because he's just radically different? Is there a difference between Israel and the world? Is there a difference between when God says to Noach, you're the only tzaddik, I'm going to destroy them all, and when God says to Moshe, leave me alone and I'm going to destroy them? You know, if you say anything, don't talk to me, because if you say, I don't want to change my mind, which Moshe takes to mean you do want to change your mind. Hadicholi, right? Which the Medrash picks up. I think it's the Pshat, actually. But the Hanicha, the Vayinachem, the Vayichal, and there's more. The word Chaim that appears over and over again. Noach Matzah Chaim and Moshe's. So the point is, it starts with the language. And then the question becomes, what is the main underlying basis of the difference between the 2 stories that Moshe prays, and Moshe wins the argument. Vayinachem Hashem Acharasha Diber Lasot Yamo, as opposed in the Mabu, Vayinachem Hashem Ki Asat Adam Ba'aretz. There are all kinds of links, which I can't get into now. But it begins with the language. The statement is a parallel statement, but then there are all kinds of interesting differences between the 2. And it's dafka the parallels that allow us to make distinctions. The point of parallels is when things are parallel, then we distinguish. Two kinds of oranges, you just apples and oranges, you don't distinguish, they're different. But the idea of parallel text, parallel language means that's our invitation to draw distinctions. There's much more to it, but that's where I'm coming from over here. Let me stop at this point. Then we'll continue next. So the plan is I want to touch upon the half tribe of Menashe, what they're doing there, just briefly, and then we'll continue with the next chapter, with the I'll continue with the very end of the middle of chapter, the Parshat Vayetchana, and Moshe's request to enter the land, which God rejects, and then chapter 4. We still have a few more weeks, and I'd like minimally to finish through chapter 4. Chapter 5 begins part 2 of Sefer Devarim. Okay, again, if anybody has any comments or questions, you can always email me at dsilber@drisha.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good day.
Just a scheduling note, we will be meeting next week, and we will be meeting the following week, the Sunday after Thanksgiving. Class will continue. I hope to see you all, and take care.